begin with something that disturbs me, and this will be the introduction to what I'd like to comment on today. Here's part of our difficult national narrative. You see, there's two things being said. One is, please come in because we need you. And on the other hand, there is kind of a pushback, a feeling of unease once immigrants come here. Now, these are both true, and this is part of the contradictions that we live. Immigration is not an easy thing. There is a whole pragmatic dimension to this that we have to get to. We cannot remain at platitudes. We need to talk about, eventually, the economics of it. We need to talk about, eventually, the security aspects of it. We need to talk about crowded hospitals, overflowing school systems, issues of language, cultural adjustments. These are all the pragmatics of immigration. Now, sometimes the danger can be, as Christians, as we begin to get into immigration, we stay so long at the ideal level, we don't get to the pragmatics. But what I want to suggest to you is we cannot stay at the ideal level, but our ideals and our values will define how we address the pragmatics. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of examples as we work our way through. Now, one of the things that disturbs me about these conversations that I've had over these years is that I can speak with those who profess the Christian faith, and the conversation is all about the economics and the cultural and the political and the security piece, which is what you need to get to eventually, of course. But as I've spoken to a number of Christians, there has been nothing specifically Christian about the conversation. And that's disturbing, and that's one of the reasons why I got into this. I'm just a prof. Now, I'm a bicultural, bilingual. I was raised that way. I'm probably the tallest Guatemalan in the history of the world. My father was an American, and my mother a Guatemalan. I have an older brother. He's 5'6". And my father was the son of Irish immigrants, and so my older brother is very white-skinned, with freckles and blue eyes. And his hair is turned gray like mine. That's a family trait. But his hair was actually light. And so here I was, 6'6", brown eyes, jet black hair, and people don't believe that anymore, but it is actually true. And here we were, this kind of genetic mistake kind of family. But we were raised bilingual and bicultural, since we were small, of course. And I've spent many years of my life in Guatemala, and I work with Hispanics, and I go to an Hispanic church. But here's what we need to do. We need to begin to think along specifically, very self-consciously, Christian and biblical ideas about immigration. Now, what happens when I begin to talk about this, and there's kind of two ways to look at it. One is, how do people of the host culture receive this? You see? And it's been interesting to watch because there is so much in the Bible about this that when I talk about it, the reaction I get is, wow, I didn't know that was in there. And then, I go with Hispanics, you see, and I begin to show them todo lo que está en la Biblia acerca de la inmigración. And the response is, wow, no sabíamos que estaba ahí en la Biblia. But the difference is, on the Hispanic side, or whatever immigrant group we're speaking to, is that now they begin to discover that in the Bible, it's very much about migration of peoples. And now we begin to see that God cares very deeply about people who migrate. In fact, the history of his people in the Bible is the history of people on the move. It is so profound that in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11, it is said that every Christian is a sojourner and a stranger. And what we begin to see is migration becomes a central metaphor for what it means to be a Christian. Because you see, we have a different citizenship. This is supposed to be a strange land. We have a different set of loyalties. We serve another king. The problem is Christians have become very comfortable in what should be a strange place. And now we work to keep the strangers out. If migration is a central metaphor for what it means to be a Christian, the more we understand about immigration, the more we will actually understand about the Christian faith. The more we will understand about God Himself. There is a reason it's such a central picture of what it means to be a Christian. We're going to start, actually, from the very beginning, because this is what happens. You see, sometimes when I'm talking to people about immigration, the very kind of natural, if you're a conservative evangelical or come from those kind of traditions, it's the Romans 13 piece. Got it. It's in the Bible. What do I tell people? You know, at least in my Bible, that's about page 1200. So why don't we go to page 1, and we'll get to page 1200, but let those first 1200 pages help us read that Romans 13 passage a bit better. Because here are the caricatures, right? We want you to help, but only help documented people, right? This is the parable of the Good Samaritan. Same idea, right? Push him off once he hears them speaking Spanish. See, something is wrong here with all of these. We have to learn how to read this whole thing as Christians and get beyond how the culture around us defines the issue. And so that's why I begin in Genesis chapter 1. Chapter 1, page 1. Every human being is created in the image of God. Now, if you've been to seminary or Bible college or whatever, or Sunday school, you know kind of what that means. And I'm a seminary prof, but I won't bore you with the details. But one way of looking at the image of God is that every human being has worth and value because every human being is made in the image of God. If you were to read the text more carefully, it is connected with ruling and subduing the earth. Now what you find is that the value of every person is not only intrinsic, and this is why Jesus will die on the cross for each one of us, but what you begin to see is every human being has infinite potential. We can rule the earth. We do it properly under God. And so now when you're talking about immigrants, you're not only talking about their value as human beings, their value because Jesus died for them, you're also talking about potential. All the giftedness, all the talents, all the things they can bring to the host country. Now let me show you how this helps us even in the legislation debate, which is something we're in the middle of right now. But you see, if every human being has value, and every human being, the immigrants included, have infinite potential, think about the DREAM Act. You see, now you're talking about facilitating the potential. Now you're talking about putting these young people on the road to enhance the nation for the common good. Now the DREAM Act makes theological sense. You see? Now you begin to think of, boy, how can we channel all of these things to help the country? And that changes the whole legislative debate. Because now legislation is not about punitive actions. It's about funneling and facilitating all of their potential for the common good of the nation. You see how you flip the whole discussion? And you've done it theologically. It doesn't mean you evade or ignore the legislation. You've got to get there. In fact, we find it in the Old Testament. We'll see this a bit later. But the question is, what are the values that drive the legislation? See, what are the moral, what's the moral vision behind it? Because that will determine the kind of laws that you create. Now, when we get to the Old Testament, there's a whole series of narratives, you see, that talk about people on the move. Let me give you some. There's a bunch of them. For instance, Think about Abram. He gets called with his extended family out of Ur of the Chaldees, ancient Babylon, now modern Iraq. They'll move to Haran, which is on the Iraq-Turkey border, and then eventually come down into Canaan. You know that story. And Abram, who will become Abraham for the rest of his life, is a migrant, a Bedouin. The only piece of land he ever buys is to bury his wife. But when he moves into the promised land, it begins well. I mean, he builds an altar and he calls on the name of God, and all this sounds very good. But if you just read a couple of verses later, there's a famine in the land, and they go to Egypt looking for food. Why do people migrate? Well, because they're hungry. You know the scene, don't you? When they get to the border, we know that the Egyptians had a series of forts on their eastern frontier. You see, they had the Nile. Unlike the Promised Land or Canaan, the water wasn't the issue because they had water. They had this massive river. Even if you look at it from a satellite, you'll see this kind of green belt. And so the Egyptians would kind of monitor who's coming in, who's coming out, because people are always wanting to come in to eat. And so as they approach the border, Abram says to his wife, look, when they ask you, tell them that you're my sister, not my wife. Now, we know later on in the narrative that they actually were related. What you see is this. He's willing, this is the father of our faith, he's willing to lie to get across the border to feed his family. What's his option? To turn around and go back in the desert and die. This is the great father of the faith. Desperate people do desperate things. Interesting. You ever thought of Abram as a migrant story? But later on, you find Joseph, and Joseph must have been this incredible jerk growing up. Everybody hated him. I mean, his brothers wanted to kill him, for goodness sakes. And so they're out there, far from home and taking care of the sheep, and gets sent by the father, to check on them, and they actually want to kill him. Actually works out better for him because they just sell him. And so he ends up in Egypt at Potiphar's house. Remember the story? Hardworking, honest. Then Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him. And he runs away. But who do you think the authorities are going to believe? The Egyptian woman or the immigrant guy? Well, he's the one who goes to jail. But in jail, he is able to interpret dreams, and he ends up with Pharaoh, actually the second to Pharaoh. And he becomes very integrated into Egyptian life. He gets an Egyptian name. He marries an Egyptian woman. He's working in the government, and he's worked with Potiphar and all of these people for a while, so he speaks the language. He's very integrated. Interestingly, if you look at the names he gives his two sons, he gives them Israelite names. So he never forgot his culture, even as he was so integrated and assimilated into Egypt. His brothers come. Remember that? You see, there's also another famine in the land for food. And as they speak to him, they don't recognize him, but he recognizes them. It's kind of odd. And people have always told me, well, years pass and people change. Well, then how come he recognizes them, but they don't recognize him? And anyway, I'd recognize my brother. It doesn't matter how many years have passed, but if you know Egyptian culture, a man of that status would have been totally shaved and painted his face, and probably had a headdress commensurate with his rank in society, and that's why they don't recognize him. And he's actually using a translator, even though he understands what they're saying. Because he never lost his mother tongue. And he goes behind the curtain, remember, and he cries because he understands what they've said. You see, being bilingual is not a threat. No es amenaza. Yo puedo dar esta presentación en español sin pena y sin problema y con mucho gusto. I can do it. I can bounce between the languages. It's a gift to the country, not a threat. And if you say, why don't they learn English? Well, all of you Mennonites come from Germany or something. Well, so when you came off the boats, did you kind of go through a force field, whoop, and now you spoke English? How long did it take your grandparents? When did your Mennonite church begin actually singing in church in English? Was that into the second generation, maybe? Third or fourth, I'm hearing. And so we get bothered when they speak with an accent. And why? The German that all of you speak is a gift that you treasure as part of your heritage, as well you should. Joseph, an immigrant story. Now, if you keep turning the pages, boom, you're in Exodus chapter 1. And this is interesting because it follows on the death of Joseph, and he had actually said, take my bones home when I die. Again, still the heart pulling him back. Exodus chapter 1. The Israelites are growing. And the numbers scare the Egyptians. The text actually says that. Now, what was the number that triggered the fear? We don't know. But there was a number, a threshold they hit, and now the Egyptians were afraid. That's such a human response. It's the numbers. Our son went to college close to Boston. If you go to Boston and you come out of South Station, you look over to your left, there's actually a sign that says, "Welcome to Chinatown." And there's tour buses that kind of go in there, right? Best Chinese foods in Chinatown. No one's bothered that in Chinatown everyone speaks Chinese. No one's bothered the signs are in Chinese. In fact, it's kind of cool. You take pictures. If you get on the tour bus, you can drive out, right? See, it's circumscribed. It's under control. The numbers just aren't there, and so no one's threatened by it. Oh, but the Hispanics are everywhere. The numbers scare us. That's such a human reaction. We do this with people when they move into our neighborhood, right? We're looking through the blinds, right? Are they gonna cut the grass and take out the garbage and their kids? Are they a bunch of brats? We're doing this kind of stuff. It's just being human, isn't it? Egyptians the same. And they begin to put all these rules and they actually try to control the population. Let's kill the baby boys. All these draconian measures to control the population, even as they want them to continue to work. Does that sound familiar? We need their labor, we just don't want them. It was the same with African Americans. See, migration and immigration is the story of labor. People looking for work and people bringing in workers. We brought blacks in, African blacks, by the hundreds of thousands to work our farms. We needed their labor, we just didn't want them. We go to civil war and pass the 13th and 14th Amendment, but a century later we still need the civil rights movement. You see, the African American story at its heart and at its root is an immigrant story. Have you ever thought about these immigrant stories like that?